afternoon, everybody. I'm Alex Nargis, and normally I get up and introduce a curator from somewhere, or one of ours, to give a talk about a subject, in this case about a brand new special exhibition which just opened to the public yesterday, American-born Hungary. But I get to introduce myself because they were trying to debate, well, who's going to introduce you, Alex, and what are they going to say? So the fact of the matter is, the only thing that's important is that you all are here today and you're going to have a whirlwind tour. This is a journey that I'm going to take you on, and I'll tell you a little bit about the journey that got us here today, because that's important too. But let me start by telling you that this exhibition's about a journey, 34 photographers who are born in Hungary and then come to America and become Americans. And their impact and influence on photography of the 20th and the 21st century is unlike and more important than any other country in the world in the 20th century, bar none. And just to put it in context, Hungary is a country the size of the Commonwealth of Virginia in terms of its land mass. It only has about 9.5 million people, so it's slightly more than live in Virginia. So imagine Virginia turning out more photographers than any other country in the world and having an impact that's almost immeasurable. Now, we have people like Sally Mann and others who are great Virginia photographers, but nowhere near the number. And this subject was explored by a few people, but usually it's only a couple of photographers, Andrei Kertész, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Brassai. Unfortunately, you will not see Brassai in the show if you haven't seen it, and look for him. He comes to America in 1957, but doesn't stay. And so for anybody to be in the show, first of all, they had to be born in Hungary, and then they have to come to America and stay here. Now, not everybody did that, at least in one case, and we have one of the artists in the show here today who came to America in 1956 after the Hungarian Revolution, married a lovely girl from Chicago, joined the Army, did some of the great war photographs of all time, as well as other photographs, and I'll show you some in a moment. But then, about 20 years ago, Laszlo, Kandor, and Linda decided to move back to Hungary, or in the case of Laszlo, move back, and Linda to actually move there. But I'm just glad that Laszlo, y'all are here today. Great photographs. But that's a journey that's a little different than the others. Let me tell you about the journey that I started on before I give you a quick view of the exhibition. My father was born and raised in Hungary, and he was a photographer. He's not in this exhibition. He was what we in the art museum field label amateur, and of course the separation between amateur and professionals is very slight. But he loved photography, and he instilled that love of photography with my brothers and I. Well, I should say I have three brothers. Two of the brothers were instilled with a love of photography. The other one, not so much. My second youngest brother is a jazz musician, and I think he may own a camera. But beyond that, I don't know that he does. He's a great jazz musician, performer, recording artist, and the rest. But I have two brothers, one in the Finger Lakes and one near San Diego, who are really great photographers. And that all became because we would go to the George Eastman House, now the George Eastman Museum, in Rochester, where we grew up. And it was about not even 2 miles from our house. And in the summer times, I would ride my bicycle up the hill on Atlantic Avenue. And I would wander the halls of the museum and the galleries. But then in the summers, I would, at 1 o'clock, Monday through Friday, I would attend films. They would do film series. And it was there that I encountered a curator, my first exposure to such a thing, in the form of a fellow named James Card. He was curator of film, and he would give a short talk before each of the films. And I became fascinated with what he was doing, and clearly he loved it. And when he retired, and I was, I think, a junior or senior in high school, there was no mention of him retiring, and he had been at the Eastman for decades and impacted so many people's lives. And I wrote a letter to the editor, and in those days, this is the early 1970s, they would put your name and your address. And James Card, when he read that in the newspaper, wrote me a thank you note and sent me a lifetime pass to the Dryden Theater at the George Eastman House. Unfortunately, I've lost it many years ago, but it opened up a world that was very different. My father came to this country with 3 earthly possessions besides the clothes he was wearing. He had a violin with a Stradivarius label in it. It turned out not to be a Stradivarius. He had a Bible. And the reason he had the Bible was that it actually had saved his life. He was a prisoner of war. He was in the Hungarian Royal Air Force until there was no more Air Force. And the Russians, the Germans, the Brits, and the Americans were all bombing Budapest. And he got captured by the Russians, spent 9 years in a prisoner of war camp. And in this camp, they were shipping the prisoners out to Siberia. Boxcar after boxcar, never to come back. And as he was in line, he asked the sergeant, could I go back to the barracks? I forgot something. And for whatever reason, the sergeant let him go back. And what he went back for was a Bible. And my father was very a-religious, spiritual, but not religious in the traditional sense. And he went back and got the Bible. By the time he came back, the American troops had come into the prison camp and stopped the Russians from having him shipped out, and saved his life and others in the process. But he comes to this country, the most important thing he actually brought wasn't the violin, which didn't do him any good, the Bible, which saved his life, but 2 cameras. And so my brothers and I and our entire family, growing up in Rochester, New York, film and photography is everything. George Eastman and Eastman Kodak, which at one time had the largest industrial park in the world with Kodak Park. It was pervasive, and today, sadly, Rochester is a mere shadow of itself, except for the George Eastman Museum, the largest, best, and oldest museum of photography on the planet. So I have my father to thank for a love of photography, inspiring photography as a photographer, but mostly as a photo historian, and being able to then identify early on, and I'm talking 40 years ago, as I was a young museum director, noticing that so many photographers I was looking at in exhibits, in the catalogs, when you look at the bios, it would say, born in Hungary. And so I started keeping notes and files and started to, and then in the spring of 1994, a couple of things happened. One, well, I got very lucky. The first thing was I wrote a synopsis for this exhibition and also one for Ansel Adams and Photographers of the American West. I've been asked by our great patron saint, Mrs. Kettering, when are you going to do an exhibition? You've been here 2 years. We want to see something. And so when Mrs. Kettering spoke, I listened. And I wrote 2 synopsises, one for the Adams Show, one for this exhibition. And my head of public relations, my counterpart to Jan Hatchett, who runs PR here, looked at me and scowled. And she said, Alex, where's the choice? An Ansel Adams exhibition or an exhibition on Hungarian Americans? Nobody's going to come to this show. I did Ansel Adams. It actually toured the country, including the George Eastman Museum. It was a very successful exhibition. But that was a piece of good fortune because it meant I had to wait before I actually dug into this exhibition. The other thing that happened in 1994, and about that very same time, I met Catherine, my wife, who literally bought me at an auction, a bachelor's auction that September. It's a true story. It was a multiple sclerosis event, and I was one of 33 bachelors. Well, let me tell you, it was magical because until recently, there were 33 photographers in this exhibition. Just 33. And the fact that I was one of 33 bachelors and she bought me and still has me, I mean, my God. But about 5 months ago, our curator of photography, who has been an enormous help and counsel to me, Sarah Kennel, who, by the way, when you go downstairs, there are 2 massive exhibitions. Mine's about 175 photographs. Hers, which is a survey of photography in the South since 1845, is something more than 200. But Sarah, in corresponding with one of the children of Stephen Deutsch, who's in this exhibition from Chicago, asked the question, my mother, Helene Beck, was also a photographer. Are you interested in her work? I was not able to find her work anywhere over the course of the last 30 years. And Sarah, thankfully, in corresponding with one of the daughters, says, well, we think some of the material is at the Chicago Historical Society, which has the archives for her husband, Stephen Deutsch. And sure enough, there are 3 photographs in the show. And so something unmagically, it's now 34 photographers. But I'm glad to have Helene Beck. So thank you very much, Sarah, for everything you've done. And I urge everybody to see that exhibition as well. And if you like lectures in this very space on Thursday at 6:30, she's going to be doing a talk on a long arc photography in the South. Okay, let me start you on the journey for this exhibition, because 30 years ago, I wrote the synopsis. It had to wait until about 12 years ago when we challenged all of our curators, or I should say charged them with the responsibility that everybody has to do a major exhibition, major and also important in your respective field. It should have a book-length publication, as well as ideally tour as an exhibition under the auspices of the Virginia Museum. Well, when we put that charge out in front of them, I also then said, the one thing it doesn't have to be is popular. And I told them what I was going to do. And at the time, my father was still alive. And I said, I know that there are going to be 7 people. There's my wife, Catherine, my father, my 3 brothers, our son. I kind of threw in an extra person for good measure, thinking maybe somebody else might wander in. But that began what has been a 12-year journey to be able to visit museums all around this country and in Europe as well, to pull together what I think is a great representation to show you the impactful nature of these many, many photographers. Most recently, the journey began in Budapest. I mean, what more appropriate place than the National Gallery in Budapest to host the show? If you could see between the columns, there are 4 photographs. Those are all photographs in the collection of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts that are in this exhibition. The show opened there, is here until January 29th, and then closes poetically at, as I mentioned, the greatest museum of photography on the planet, the George Eastman Museum, in September of next year. The exhibition is arranged in 8 sections, and so this is really the journey that you will go on through the exhibition. How many people have been through the exhibition already? Have you had a chance to see it? So a number of you have. Well, this is a good introduction for those that haven't. There's a lot to see. But the show's arranged in 8 sections. We start out in Hungary, and then the journey takes you through the various places that these photographers went. Not all of them went to the Bauhaus and to Germany and Paris, but they all end up in America. I also break out 2 sections because arguably in the area of photojournalism, war photography, no one's had more impact than Hungarian American photographers. The other, though, is with fashion photography, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. So we start out in Hungary. Many of them are photographers in Hungary. Andrei Kertész was a young guy who his mother wanted him to be a banker. He wanted to take photographs. And this is a photograph from 1917. And mind you, if you look at how far my finger and my thumb are apart, that's how big the photograph is. It's a contact print from, there are in fact 2 cameras in the exhibition, thanks to Robert Gerbo, who is the curator and head of the Andrei Kertész Foundation. They've lent us 2 cameras. Actually, they come from Victor Gerbo as a loan. But so you get to see one of his Leicas and then an earlier camera to show you some sense of how these photographers are capturing works like the one you see on the screen. Pictorialism in the early part of the 20th century, and even beyond in Hungary, was the style of photography adopted by most of the photographers. Soft-focused, warm papers, romantic, lyrical, works like this by Reves. It's all about a romantic look at photography. And this was what predominated in Hungary and much of the world in the late 19th century into the first quarter of the 20th century. But then by the teens, modernism takes hold. If you walk away from this exhibition with nothing other than the fact that modernism was embraced by these Hungarian-American photographers and then spread and influenced generations of photographers in this country and photographers around the world, that's the one takeaway that's most important. And I'll talk a little bit more about modernism in a moment. But here you get to see, in this case, Ferenc Kár, already beginning to look at things with a modernistic lens. You know, acute angles, great shadows, fabulous contrast. And you'll see this over and over again in so many of the works. There is a wall. I'll give you a quick preview for those of you who have not been downstairs yet. There's a wall where there's a grouping of 4 photographs. And I've pulled these out of order from geography because they are all photographs, very much modernist in their sensibilities. Here you see someone walking down the street that's wet, obviously from rain. You see their shadow. You see an umbrella. You do not see them from the shoulders up. I mean, this is the essence of modernism. But these 4 photographs are all photographs of nothing but feet. Kertész goes back to Budapest for the first time in 20 years after the war and takes a whole series of photographs that are fabulous. And then a number of these photographers go to Germany. They go to the Bauhaus, which was created as a center to teach basically the German equivalent of American arts and crafts, hand-crafted, hand-built, an emphasis on craftsmanship. At the time that Laszlo Moholy-Nagy goes there is no photography, but his new wife teaches him the art of photography, and with this, he begins to take what he labels as photograms. This is not using a camera to make a photograph. Light-sensitized paper with objects laid on the paper exposed to light and then processed. And this is so important. Now, at the same time, Michael Taylor's here. For those of you who remember the great show that he did on Man Ray photographs in Paris a couple of years ago, Man Ray invented rayographs, and the two of them apparently competed a bunch on who invented photograms, rayograms first. The fact is, neither of them did. Photograms, or some essence of them, have been around since the beginning of photography in the first half of the 19th century. But you have these fabulous examples that are just the epitome of what is this new wave influencing photography around the world, coming out of the Bauhaus in Germany. Surrealism is also starting in the 1920s, becoming a major influence on photography, on painting, on sculpture. I mean, here you have Moholy-Nagy taking pictures of dolls on a balcony. But look at the pattern in this image. Look at the lines, the repetition. Again, all of the elements of the vocabulary that many of them adopt and then share and influence others with. I mean, again, this one by Martin Munkaci. in the exhibition, you will see for many of these photographers, two names. Martin Munkashi being his westernized name, and then Marmelstein Marton being their original Hungarian name. Now, many of the names were Magyarized. They made them into Hungarian-sounding names. But most of all, what they also tried to do was try to make them be less Jewish. Because the majority of artists in this exhibition were Jewish. And it's one of the major reasons. People ask me all the time, well, why did they leave Hungary? Well, the fact of the matter is that starting in the teens and into the 20s, virtually anybody who was Jewish was not a welcome citizen within Hungary. I mean, the anti-Semitism was literally off the charts. And so they left for other places. Sadly, a number of them left for Germany, and by 1933, they have to leave again. They end up going, in many cases, to Paris, and of course, the Germans arrived there in 1940. But you look at these photographs, and this one again, shadows, the repetition and pattern. Look at the stones that have laid out with this great grid pattern. And they're doing this very purposely. The other one of the hallmarks is the acute angle. And wherever Munkashi was shooting this from a balcony or a building, and you'll see this over and over again. I promise you more feet, these four photographs just look so great together. And more. But the essence of modernism, I mean, it's totally fascinating. And yet one more of we have a policeman here in Berlin in 1930. Look at the shadow. I mean, the shadow is basically twice as long as he is tall. The contrast. All right, many of them, not all, but many of them go to Paris. It's the capital of the art world in the 20s and 30s, and there was a huge community of Hungarians, first in Berlin. In fact, the Bauhaus, it's said that without the Hungarians, there wouldn't have been a Bauhaus. In Paris, they gathered up at Café du Monde, and it's amazing because they would have an enclave, writers, painters, and many photographers, all speaking Hungarian, because many of them, like André Kertész, couldn't really speak French too well. Robert Capa, who I'll talk about a little bit later, actually spoke something which was labeled Capanese. He would speak French with a Russian accent, English with a French accent, and of course all of the words intermixed, and nobody understood most of what he said. And the other question that people have asked me a lot, and I don't have the answer, is why Hungarians? Well, a likely major reason is that Hungarian as a language is virtually impenetrable. It is not related to virtually anything else and is maybe the most difficult. For me, it's more difficult than trying to learn Mandarin. And when we were growing up as kids, my mother was Italian and my father was Hungarian, and we weren't allowed to speak or learn either language. I mean, this is all about, assimilating. And we were only allowed to speak American, which was my dad's term for English. But I heard Hungarian every day growing up, literally every day growing up for the first 18 years. I have no idea what Hungarians say. I have one phrase, I'll teach you, all of you, that today. Nem, which means no, and then értem, which means I don't understand. So if you go to Hungary, it will be the most useful phrase you have. So they go to Paris. I mean, my God, this photograph, how important André Kertész is to this narrative. There are more photographs by Kertész than any other photographer in this show. And he has more impact quite frankly, than any other photographer in the show, and that says a lot given how many there are and how much influence they had. But this fabulous night scene from Paris in 1926. And then, again, shadows, the acute angle, the repetition, the pattern. Oh my God, this is one of those photographs, and there's so many of them that I look at and I say, I wish I took that photograph. And you see this little incidental person. I don't know. That doesn't, the pointer doesn't work. The little incidental person on the right corner down the stairway. Yeah, it's just, that's fabulous. And then, oh my God, talk about pattern and repetition again. Something as simple as shadows of these chairs in a park in Paris. I mean, how absolutely beautiful does it get? Well, it gets more beautiful because you get photographs like this. And of course, this was illustrated in one of the books, Paris, Kertész in Paris. And, you know, they're playing musical chairs, they're reciting poetry, maybe they're doing a manifesto of some kind, but you're left waiting to find out what are these guys doing. But look at the shadows and the way from the upper right to the lower left, the entire picture just flows and is in motion. And you have all of these guys who look like they're all dressed in black. And then this one guy slumped in the middle who's apparently worn out from whatever they're doing. But, you know, it's the essence of modernism and the epitome of beautiful. And then Kertész, on the note of surrealism, does a series of almost 200 photographs using a funhouse mirror, and does these works which he calls distortions. And Robert Gerbo, the head of the Kertész Foundation, one day says to me, well, Alex, you know, we have the mirror. And I looked at him and I said, what do you mean you have the mirror? He said, the mirror that Andre used, we have the mirror. The mirror, for those of you who haven't been downstairs yet, is in the exhibition, so you can stand in the exhibition, look at the mirror, make your own distortion if you like. But he did a series of about 200 of these. He did not think of himself as a surrealist, but it's hard not to look at so many of his works and not think of him in the realm of surrealism. Speaking of surrealism, oh my gosh, Anna Barna. Anna Barna was absolutely unknown until recently. André Kertész knew her in Paris. She was a photojournalist while he was there. This is back in the 1930s. He comes to America in 1936. She follows sometime after, we think 1945, 1946. And then in the early 80s, Robert Gerbo, who is Andre's curator, pulls out a box of photographs and asks Andre, whose work is this? And Andre says, that's Anna Barna. She was murdered. And Robert said, I'm sorry, who's Anna Barna and who killed her? And we don't believe she was murdered. In fact, Sarah Morthland, a photo historian, did a bunch of research on Anna Barna. There's not a lot to find out, but she apparently befriended Kertész when she arrived in America again, and then when she died, she gave him all of her earthly possessions, which were very few: photographs, a couple of IDs, and a few other personal possessions, and that's it. And so she was lost to the world of photography. The National Gallery included her in an exhibition on women photographers last year. We now have several of her works in our collection. And, you know, as you saw before with the image of dolls on the balcony that Moholy Nagy did, I mean, it doesn't get any more surrealistic or eerie than this. Absolutely just a beautiful photograph that I included in the show for no other reason other than it's such a fabulous play on light and design. Moholy Nagy is down in Marseille, shooting this obviously down into the port from some building along the way. And then here you have Kertész in Paris, and instead of an incidental person at the bottom of a stair, an incidental tower that we all know, squeezed in between two buildings on the far right side of the photograph, which is showing a construction site in 1935. But beautiful light. I mean, a sensitivity of light and shadow that is virtually unsurpassed. As I mentioned, photojournalism and war photography, absolutely at the top of the list of influence that Hungarian Americans had on the world of photography. Martin Munkacsy was working as a photojournalist and influenced everybody in the field, because he did things differently. He strapped himself to the side of a motor car in a race and leaned out of the car so he could get a better angle, or stood in front of a motorcyclist coming through mud. I mean, talk about an image. This photograph, which he did in 1931 of four young boys running into the surf in Liberia. Henri Cartier-Bresson, and I'm sure most of you know his name, one of the greatest photographers of all time. And he's the one that coined the term, the decisive moment. He saw this photograph, and as a young man, he said, I picked up a camera and had to go outside and take photographs, and this made me become a photographer. I mean, that's how much influence these photographers had on generations of people, like somebody like Henri Cartier-Bresson. But I mean, what a fabulous contemporary image almost 100 years later. Okay, Virginia shows up again and again, and this is my first slide that brings us back home, and this is Marion Palffy. She is Hungarian, but is born and raised in Germany. Her father was a professor in Berlin. She always thought of herself as Hungarian, went to Hungarian schools. It was her first language. But she comes to America, and she's basically a sociologist with a camera. But like so many of the photographers in this exhibition, they leave Hungary, either the land of anti-Semitism, the land of unbelievable inflation. I can remember my father telling me that when he was a boy in the 1920s, it would take a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. And I thought my father was telling me stories, and then when I was a teenager, I started collecting coins and going to the Numismatic Society and started collecting paper money and came upon a 1 billion pengo piece of currency. And it's like, well, I guess Dad wasn't kidding when he said that it took a wheelbarrow full of cash. But they leave the war, all of the things behind, coming to America, where they think the avenues are paved in gold, that this is the land of opportunity and freedom. And what they find are pictures or scenes like this that in Charlottesville, literally on the other side of the tracks. And they become very sympathetic to the plight of African Americans, Indigenous American, Native American people, and others, and in the poverty that they encounter. And oh my God, talk about a powerful photograph. These young children on an alley with the U.S. Capitol in the background. How much more do you need of a statement of inequality than this one, which is beautiful in its subtle way, but a statement that is so very important, for that matter, to today as well. And then she's down in a town in Georgia in 1949 and takes the picture of the widow of a man who was arrested, jailed, and they pulled him out of jail and lynched him. Yet he was innocent. And when she was doing these photographs, she was told by one of the people in the city hall that, you really need to stop taking pictures and you really need to leave, because this is not very healthy for you. politics. Cornell Capa, who founded the International Center for Photography in New York, the brother of Robert Capa, who I'll talk about in just a moment, followed JFK on the campaign trail. And then Laszlo Kondor. How much better does it get? It's on the back cover of the catalog. I mean, this picture of these three young boys with American flags in Chicago in 1968. I mean, again, the dichotomy between the world they were probably living in and then the promise of an opportunity that the American flag represents for them. And what great light. Oh, my God. Sylvia Plocke, who spent 3 decades or more as the Village Voice official photographer, going back to, in this case, East Berlin in 1989, and had a great picture called Wise Guy. All right, war photography. Robert Capa, who was clearly not Robert Capa to begin with, was in Paris in 1936, not selling photographs. His name wasn't getting any attention, and he and his girlfriend, Gerda Tero, who was a photographer, decided to create a persona. And whether they created the persona based on Frank Capra, the great movie director of the time, It Happened One Night and things like that, or the other story is that in Hungarian, Capa means shark, and that was his nickname as a kid. But he creates this persona of Robert Capa, this wealthy American photographer who does photojournalism, and they start passing these photographs off and selling them to Vue magazine and the other outlets, and he becomes Robert Capa. He goes to Spain and takes what arguably could be the most important and most famous war photograph of all time. A Spanish soldier at the time he's being shot and dies. This, by the way, was actually the subject of a book because of great controversy whether or not Capa staged it. And to his dying day, he absolutely insisted, no way, I was there. Because his phrase, and I've got it up on one of the walls in the exhibition, if your photographs aren't good enough, it's because you're not close enough. And sadly, Robert Capa in 1954 is up in Japan doing some shoot, and one of the news agencies calls him up and says, we need you to go down to French Indochina. Our photographer got sick, and we need you to accompany the French and Vietnamese troops. And he does. He goes out into a rice paddy to get a different view and steps on a mine and dies, clutching his camera in death, muttering the last few words, but not letting go of his camera. Photographs that he did in the Spanish Civil War, but if it weren't for Robert Capa, we wouldn't have any real images of the landing, that first landing at Normandy Beach on D-Day. Now, for those of you, and I should have included it in this show, but Charles Schulz, decades ago, did a cartoon with Snoopy landing at the beach at Normandy. And he's there with the tank barriers, and it's an homage to all of the soldiers who gave up their lives on D-Day. And it's based on a Robert Capa photograph. There are only 13 that survived, and there's another long story about how the photographs, he puts the bags of film into a bag and sends them off to be processed in London because he's not doing it out in the field. And apparently the young guy doing it kept them a little too close to the heater, burned all of them except 13 photographs. And that's why you see the wrinkling at the bottom of the emulsion in this photograph. It's probably not a really true story, but it makes for a great story. And if nothing else, I'll tell you this about Hungarians. Kertész, Capa, they all tell the greatest stories. I mean, very little truth to most of them, but it makes for makes for a great talk because I'm repeating many of them, and I love every one of them and believe most of them myself. The Capa taking pictures also, obviously, of the grim side. Here it is just days before the end of the war, and an American who's now been killed by a sniper. Speaking of Laszlo Kondo, yet another, hey, talk about an American patriot. He joins the Army. This is Vietnam, goes to Vietnam, has already been a photographer, and then starts working for the U.S. Army, taking what are clearly the best and most important pictures of that terrible conflict. This one in 1970. Great photographs, Laszlo. Most of them come to New York. Obviously, it's the port of entry for so many people as immigrants. And, for all of the people that talk about illegal immigration, we have yet to actually see the papers that my own father had. He worked his way on a freighter from Bremen, Germany in 1950, and whether he got off the boat and went through Ellis Isle or not, we're not really sure. Became an American citizen, like all of these other photographers, but they encounter in New York, in this case, in the 20s and 30s. Here we have John Albach. My father was a tailor, came to this country not as a tailor, but his family had a butcher shop, but learned tailoring. And John Albach had a tailor shop up in what was Little Budapest in the Upper East Side in New York. Downstairs was the tailor shop. Upstairs he had his home and his dark room, and then was out taking pictures, again showing a sympathy for the people who did not have a life of consequence. On a positive side, this is the Great Depression in 1933. Back to surrealism, one of the most fabulously beautiful poetic pictures in this exhibition, called "The Lost Cloud" by Andrei Kertész. And then the cover of the book by Kertész. Talk about lyrical. Here you have painters on a fire escape, the pattern, the repetition, the contrast. All those elements repeated again in just an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous photograph. And a picture under the L. This is Arnold Eagle. By the way, I mentioned with Arnold Eagle just because if you think about the name, it sounds very much like a Hungarian name, right? Arnold Eagle. Not at all, because so many of them changed their names, anglicized their names, and one of the things that this exhibition does is bring light to all of these photographers. And I'll give you one example. I was visiting one of the other major art museums in this country. They have a curatorial photography department with 3, 4, 5 people in it. The head of that department's an Eastern European specialist. They had 9 photographers that are in this exhibition, in their collection. 3 were labeled as American, no mention as Hungary. 3 were labeled as Hungarian, no mention of America. And only 3 of the 9 were labeled properly as American, born Hungary, which is where, by the way, we get the name for the exhibition. And that's because this legacy has not been told to its fullest. And this exhibition clearly will change that. All right. A trivia quiz, if you ever get asked, what is the photograph, the most famous photograph that you didn't know was a photograph in the history of the planet? And has been seen more times by more people than anything else photographic. Well, that's because Marcel Sternberger was commissioned to do a portrait in 1939 of FDR. When Roosevelt died, the Mint then was commissioned to do a coin, the U.S. dime, and the sculptor, who, by the way, on the U.S. Mint site is regarded as the artist, takes the photograph by Marcel Sternberger, flips it around. I should have flipped the dime around. I guess I had Should have thought of that before. But flips the dime around, or flips the photograph around, and then sculpts the plaster of FDR from the photograph. Last year, 500 million dimes were minted in this country. There are billions of dimes in circulation. So if anybody has a dime, you actually have the rendition of a Hungarian-American photograph in your pocket right now, and no other photograph has ever been seen ever as much than this one. Unless somebody wants to dispute that, I'm sorry. All right, another connection to Richmond, and this is Laszlo Einer, who is taking a picture in New York, and we have our own native Bill Bojangles Robinson at a baseball game up in New York. Anna Barna with a very different image, but in this case, think back to that photograph from 1926 of Paris at night by André Kertész, her good friend. And then look at this and you see, an influence and similarity. An absolutely gorgeous photograph. And yet another connection to Virginia, Kertész, who spends about 15 years as a photojournalist in America, hating it every bit along the way. His photo editors said, stop taking pictures that speak so much and just do your assignment. And for years he was crushed. And then finally in 1962, he quits his job, says, I've had enough, and goes to the Museum of Modern Art and goes to see the curator and says, I'd love to have you see my work. He admitted and lamented that he had been forgotten for decades. And so this is a work, though, he had done on assignment somewhere in the late 1940s from just up the road. Paula Wright with this fabulous image from 1960. I'll also note, because in the book, as I was writing the catalog for this exhibition, I got to the end of writing and I realized I had missed something. And that was a chapter on women photographers, because there are so many of them and so important that they needed their own, pardon the pun, focus as photographers. Georgie Lorenzi, who comes to this country and sadly doesn't live very long after coming to America, and does what is very likely the earliest, most important photo book. And I'm not talking about a book with photographs, lots of folks have done it, but a book where the book, its photography, is the end product. And today you see them everywhere you turn with photographers, but Lorenzi was doing that with this great book called New York, New York in 1968. Orsi Drozdik, and a contemporary photographer. This exhibition takes you all the way up into the end of the 20th century. These are works that we had just acquired recently. A number of them go to Chicago. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy goes to Chicago in 1936. It happens to be one of the major centers for Hungarian Americans, but he's there because he's been asked to recreate the Bauhaus. He tries, it fails within the first year, and then tries yet again. And it becomes part of the first degree-granting college that offers a degree in photography in the United States. And so many photographers. As many of you may know, we acquired the Aaron Siskin collection and archives a few years ago. Sarah is the Aaron Siskin curator of photography. 8,000 Siskin photographs, clearly one of the most important photographers of all time. And he and so many others owe an allegiance to what that school did in Chicago. Georgie Kapesh, who goes on to MIT and does a whole series of books, The Confluence of Science and Art. Just amazing work that he's creating these sets. Solarization by Capa, and very experimental, and you'll see this repeated throughout the show. And then, in Chicago, Sarah Kennel's favorite photographer of all time. She hates his work. Well, I should take that back. You'll see another photograph in a moment. But Ansel Adams hated the work of Max Thorick. Max Thorick actually hated the work of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, thought all of this contemporary cutting-edge stuff was terrible. He was somebody that harkened back into the 19th century with these highly manipulated, highly, I'm not even sure what word to use that's polite. Okay, that's the nice word. Thank you, Frank. Theatrical, yes. He was also capable of doing quite beautiful photographs that have this modernist edge. But I'll just tell you this about Max Thorick. He was a noted, and I mean very, still to this day, noted surgeon and author in the medical field, but he lays claim to the most exhibited photographer basically of all time. Participated in more than, and I'm not making this up, 4,000 exhibitions. Now, where he found time to write all these medical books, do surgery, and then enter 4,000 exhibitions across the world is just, it's hard to understand. I mentioned earlier Stephen Deutsch. This is one of the photographs from Chicago by him. And then Helene Deutsch, his wife, who actually is Helene Beck, and pictures that when they were down in Mexico in the mid-1930s, she took. And then Michael Simon, who great photographer, a fabulous professor of photography, taught a couple of generations of photographers up at Beloit College, and then a major collector of Hungarian photography that is now in the collection at the Getty with powerful, very contemporary photographs from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. All right, Hungarians in Hollywood. I keep dropping my mints. One of the other destinations in this journey is that so many of them end up in Los Angeles. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, several of the studios, Fox and Paramount in particular, were founded by, no surprise, Hungarian immigrants. And there was a saying in Hollywood that it's not enough to be talented, to be successful in Hollywood, but you also have to be Hungarian. And so Nicholas Murray and others, here's a great picture of Joan Crawford and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. On the beach at Santa Monica. I mean, beautiful still photographs and then scenes like, and Laszlo Willinger was probably the most important studio photographer in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s. I mean, what a great picture of Clark Gable and Joan Crawford, but I mean, my God. I mean, just you can see why the golden age of Hollywood was so golden. Part of it was generated by great photographs done by Hungarian-American photographers. And I don't know that Katharine Hepburn ever looked quite as beautiful as she does in this picture. I mean, a beautiful woman, I'm sure, but nothing quite as stunning as what Martin Munkashi took of her. Norma Jean Mortensen, who became Norma Jean Baker, but not before she met a Hungarian who added D-E to his names, so he became André Dedine, sounding French. Thought he could sell more pictures. Goes out to Hollywood right after the war. He had a studio in New York, and asked an agency, the Blue Star Modeling Agency, for a model. He wanted somebody new, fresh, And they sent over this young girl, 18 years old, Norma Jean, and they fell in love. They go off on this epic journey for like 4 months. Her husband's a merchant marine out in the ocean somewhere. He proposes marriage to her, and she turns him down because she says, I'm sorry, Andre, I want to be in pictures. And not still pictures, but the movies. And they stayed friends throughout the rest of her very short life. But it was his photographs that caught the attention of studio people in Hollywood, and they brought her in, and of course she becomes Marilyn Monroe. And you look at this innocent young girl here in 1949, and they had met about 3 years earlier, and you think, wow, had it not been for Andre Didines, we might not have ever known her. All right, the other area is all about Hungarians and fashion photography. And I can say without hesitation, it's an area they had the most influence on photography. And it starts with this photograph in 1933. Fashion photography before Martin Munkaci was all stayed in a studio, lights, sets, very almost 19th century in its design. Munkaci has come to this country, and Carmel Snow, who works for the Hearst Corporation, says, oh, while you're here, would you mind doing a fashion shoot? We're putting out a new bathing suit line, and mind you, it's wintertime. And so he says, sure, but I want to do it out at the beach, and I want the models to run. And Carmel Snow is like, are you sure? And William Randolph Hearst called her into his office and said, have you lost your mind? This is a bathing suit. This is a fashion shoot. This doesn't look like fashion photography. This is what changed fashion photography forever. Richard Avedon, arguably the most famous of all of the 20th century photographers in the world of fashion, certainly the best known. Richard Avedon, as a kid, is tearing photographs out of magazines and pinning them up on his wall in his bedroom at home of works by Munkaci. And fashion photographers all say they owe everything to him. And he changed that world forever. I mean, talk about an absolutely beautiful, poetic, and fun photograph that he does, in this case, of a woman jumping across the rain. Oh, I mean, all right. People ask me, so how do you choose when you're curating a show? You know, there's this journey. There's obviously being able to find most representative photographs by these photographers. This one I picked just because it's plain beautiful. Obviously a beautiful dress, but it speaks to the language of Hungarian modernism, Hungarian-American modernism, with these great shadows, the linearity. I mean, it's just a beautiful, beautiful photograph. When we were shut down in March of 2020, with the beginning of the pandemic, we all went home. We were closed for 3.5 months. I had 6 boxes of notes, and I was going to take a sabbatical to write the book for the show, and I took this photograph, a carbon copy of this photograph, out and started writing the chapter on fashion photography, and the rest of it just flowed after that. That's how impactful to me that photograph is. If you haven't heard yet, beginning in April, thank you, Michael Taylor, our Chief Curator and Deputy Director, we are going to host a major exhibition of the work of Frida Kahlo for 6 months, no less. But Nicholas Murray, who was quite the raconteur, met Frida Kahlo. They became lovers. He wanted to marry her. In fact, when she divorced Diego Rivera, it was his opportunity, and it didn't happen because she ends up remarrying Diego Rivera. But, you know, you want to talk about an idol of the 20th century as a painter, as an artist, as a personality, and no one captured her as well as Nicholas Marais. And then on a closing note, I'm sorry. This is in a case rather than on the wall, because it's a work for hire. Marais was asked to work for the Richmond-based company and did this picture of Duke's mayonnaise. And back in 1994, when I wrote the synopsis for this exhibition, I started dating Catherine, and I went to her house and opened up the refrigerator to get a beer out or something, and there was a jar of Duke's mayonnaise. You know, she was born in Virginia, raised in North Carolina. I thought, okay, she knows her mayonnaise, so she's got to be good. And, it's not a great work of art, but it's a beautiful photograph, and it's all about Richmond, Virginia. And so our exhibition people were able to find, we actually looked at vintage, trying to find something from 1940, a Duke's mayonnaise jar exactly like this. We could not find one. They searched, what are the buying sites? You know, you go on the internet and can buy whatever, and then tried some of the local museums, ended up getting a jar of mayonnaise at the grocery store, because it looks very similar to this. They were able to take the expires on date off the outside of it. And then, of course, there got to be a debate with our conservators saying, I'm sorry, you're going to put a mayonnaise jar in the exhibit? We're going to have to take the mayonnaise out. We're going to have to paint the inside of the jar to look like mayonnaise, and then we'll give it back to you. And I think Michael told them, enough foolishness, stop it. Just keep the jar sealed. We'll put the mayonnaise in the case. It'll be okay. But it's a fitting exclamation point to this exhibition of American photographers who are all born in Hungary, and then share themselves not only with America and the world, but with Richmond and Virginia. So thank you all very much for being here today, and thank you very much for listening.